Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us today for this panel discussion with members of the Job Creators Alliance. With us this morning are Tom Stemberg, who was founder of Staples and is now a venture capitalist, helping the next generation of entrepreneurs do the same thing he did in starting Staples, supporting a lot of businesses like City Sports and Lululemon. John Allison, who was the CEO and chairman of BB&T Corporation, led BB&T through the financial crisis without a single down quarter and built it over his 20-year career there from a small bank in my hometown of Wilson, North Carolina, with $4 billion in assets to a huge $150-some-odd billion banking powerhouse, now one of the top 20 banks in the country, and currently a professor at Wake Forest University. And finally, Mike Whalen, who is founder of Heart of America Group, which started with one restaurant, the Machine Shed in Des Moines, Iowa, and is now one of the largest hospitality companies in the Midwest, owning or operating 27 hotels and restaurants throughout 6 states in the Midwest and employing about 4,000 people. So this morning what we'd like to do is to present to you first some results of a poll that we have out today on job creation and government policy. And Mike is going to go through that with you, and then we'll have a discussion of some of the issues in the real world that are affecting job creators and how they're affecting how they may affect job creation in the future and how they'll affect the next generation of entrepreneurs. So, Mike, I'll turn it over to you. We'll go to the first page of our poll results. This is a poll conducted by YouGov, directed by Tom Reilly, who is a Democrat pollster. So we didn't cook the numbers here to support business. We ran this poll over the weekend of about 2,000 respondents nationwide, balanced sample throughout the country. So, Mike, turn it over to you.
Well, I think the interesting thing here is, and I want to emphasize this is not some kind of right-wing conspiratorial poll done by business people that want to show that the American public doesn't believe in regulation. This was done by a Democratic pollster, and it was straight up in the questions. But I think what you're seeing is an overall trend of the questions is the American public is recognizing that the tsunami of regulations that we've had thrown at American business in just the last 3-4 years. I guess it's the great experiment and where the tipping point is in job creation, and I think we found it. And the American public, I think, has a very good intuitive sense that they can smell the fact that we've hit that tipping point, and that's why the great American job creation machine isn't producing like it's had historically with this kind of tsunami of regulations that hit. In general, 71% said that they believe that the current regulatory environment hurt or it had no effect. I'm not sure how you could say no effect. Only 29%, and I always said you can get 20% to vote for anything in that, believe that it's helped. So overwhelmingly, almost 3/4 of Americans say, no, we know that. And where are they getting that? They're getting it at their employment, where they're hearing stories about it. They're hearing it firsthand. This is not some kind of policy wonk debate in Washington, D.C. They're going to work and hearing it from their coworkers, from their bosses, from the people that they oversee, of how these new regulations coming in are hurting them. Which one is the best approach? And then next slide, which one of the following things do you think is the best thing to get back on track? Lo and behold, they're basically saying, I guess in my opinion, stop the music. Almost 60% basically said you need to stop. We need to take a time out. We need to limit the size of government, keep taxes low, and reduce regulatory burden. And if you look at that, if you look at the idea of what do you think the best approach to getting that back on track, even if you look at basically the key groups of independents and Republicans, the vast majority agree that to limit the size of government and keep taxes low is overwhelmingly the best way to get the job creation machine going back again. So when you see a similarity of over and over and over, 57%, again, just short of 60%, think that right now that there isn't a good balance, that there's too much of tax and regulation going on, And again, I think there's a pretty general agreement among certainly Republicans, independents, that we've hit that tipping point where the job creation machine has slowed down. When you look at, and I think that Tom can certainly address this, when you look at the kind of avalanche that we've had between the uncertainty of taxes, and you can sit there, I'm one of the 4.5 million pass-throughs, so-called pass-through sub-S's, LLCs, that when somebody's talking about changing my personal tax rate, that's my company tax rate. Then you look at Obamacare, and I go to my healthcare providers, and I keep asking them, what is this going to mean? I mean, this is coming right around the corner. They say, Mike, we still can't tell you they're writing the regulations. And then I talked to my bankers, and they said, Mike, they have got us terrified to make loans. I just spoke to a banker the other day that had been out of banking in 6 years. He called me, he says, I need loans. He says, you got anything good in the pike? And I said, yeah, I got a couple projects. He said, oh, it's just so tough. I said, what's the difference? What's the difference between now and 6 years ago? And he said, Mike, it's really, really simple. 6 years ago, we didn't make loans thinking every moment. And John, you can address this. What are the regulators going to say? He said, right now, it's 24/7 pervasive thought that the first thing anytime somebody brings in a loan, what are the regulators going to say? So I guess to sum it up, the polls sensing what's happening out there in the flyover land where I live, which is the real world that creates the jobs. John, Tom?
I think the good news is the economy's getting better, and people are kind of enthused about that. You see that reflected in the stock market. There's a deeper bad news. The bad news is the economy ought to be doing much better today than it is. Having been through economic recoveries, I've been in the banking business 40 years. By this point in economic recovery, we ought to be having a very rapid growth rate. And the bad news on top of that is that if you look forward, people that are thoughtful are really concerned because to the degree that we're even driving growth, we're sacrificing the future for the present. We're running massive deficits. We're not dealing with our long-term structural problems. The president's budget doesn't deal with any of the long-term structural issues. So smart, thoughtful business people that are really making long-term investments are being extraordinarily cautious, and that keeps jobs from being created. It is interesting, too, that a lot of that burden is falling on small businesses. If you look at the loan growth numbers, you guys have probably been following the loan growth. It's encouraging because loans are finally growing, but it's all large businesses that are borrowing money. When we look at our failure rates now, it's almost all small businesses failing because these people struggled through the last 3 or 4 years, and the economy, while it might be getting a little bit better, it's not getting good enough for those businesses to turn around. And usually at this point in the recovery, you're actually getting way above normal growth rates because you're coming off a low base. And why is that? And I think the reason is we fundamentally have a failed experiment. And the experiment was about more government, and it's failed. And the regulatory environment, I've been in the banking business 40 years, is the most destructive in my career. It is off the chart, and Mike described it well. There's a micromanagement of the lending business, which actually hurts small businesses, right? If you tighten credit standards, it's not Exxon that has a problem, right? It's the guy that's got a kind of a struggling small business, and he's having a much more difficult time getting credit. And the tax burden, it's easy to talk about guys flying around in jet planes. The tax burden is really going to kill small businesses like Mike's that are really individual run businesses, and they're not spending the money. They may live well, but the money's being reinvested in their business. How do small businesses get big, right? The people that own the businesses reinvest the money. If they have to pay a bunch of taxes, they don't have the reinvestment to create jobs. And I hate that I think we've got a false sense of optimism. Not that things aren't getting better. They are getting better. But we're not dealing with our long-term problems. And what we're doing, I think, is unethical in relation to our children and our grandchildren. Because we're pushing the problems forward, and it's popular to do that. And the stock market, by the way, reacts to that because it likes short-term consequences. And if you print a bunch of money, as the Federal Reserve is doing, it has to go somewhere. And a lot of it's ended up in the stock market today. But there hadn't been the kind of courage and self-discipline and leadership that we need to get back on track. which looks like less government spending. It looks like a more rational tax structure, and it certainly looks like a more entrepreneurial society, because America's strength is our ability to innovate and create. We make a lot more money in this country because we've been innovative and creative, and we have the kind of regulatory environment that is making it very difficult for businesses to be creative and innovative. I think about my successor at BB&T. When I was CEO of BB&T, I probably spent 25% of my time related to regulators, and that was not much fun. But my successor is probably spending 60% of his time dealing with regulators. And it's not just time, it's thinking capacity. You can only think so much, and if you have your best and brightest people trying to make some government bureaucrat happy, instead of trying to figure out how to create wealth and well-being and produce jobs and most business people get it wrong, and Tom's a classic example. Business people like money, but they aren't motivated by money. They're motivated by the fun of the game. And that is
building stuff.
It's building stuff. They're builders, and that's the wrong. And people in government don't get that because they're not builders. They're not builders, and builders want to build. And if you got a balls and chains on you that are keeping you from building, it's very frustrating, and it's also very counterproductive in terms of that whole building process. And we've just put a bunch of balls and chains on the most creative people in our society.
I've spent much of my adult life helping to create businesses like Staples and PetSmart and Lululemon, and now emerging companies like here in the DC area. We've got City Sports is an investment of ours, and Pinkberry is an investment of ours, and Jay McLaughlin's an investment of ours. But what's going on now is we are regulating the job creators to death. Can you get that chart for a second?
I'll pull it in a second. But
Basically, the amount of economically meaningful regulations in the first 3 years of the Obama administration is up 30-fold. That's not threefold, 30-fold over the first 3 years of the Bush administration. We have got regulations on everything. Now, believe me, I've started a few businesses, some that work and some that fail. It is really, really hard. You hire employees subject to having money. You get money subject to having employees and vendors, and and all that subject to having customers. And you got to do all that at once and keep all those balls flying. It is really hard. And now on top of that, we lay on a barrage of regulations. And let me just talk about Obamacare is probably the single biggest one that's out there. And some of the stuff that's there, I get a lot of grief about talking about lactation chambers. I want to, for the record, I'm a big believer in breastfeeding. My wife breastfed my 6-year-old. He's very healthy as a result, and I'm big in favor of breastfeeding. Having said that, every employer with 50 employees or more has got to provide a lactation chamber. Now, I got a letter from Congressman Maloney saying it's not true. It is true. It simply says you have to have a separate room. It can't be a bathroom. It's got to have a door on it. It can't be used for other purposes at the same time. It's got to have privacy. Well, in a Staples store or a PetSmart store, they got a manager's office. That doesn't qualify. They got a cafeteria. That's not private. They got a bathroom. That doesn't qualify. They got a computer room. That's too cold. There are no other rooms. So you have to create a separate room in every store to provide a place for people to lactate. Now, I'm all for breastfeeding, but that's the kind of outreach that's in those 2,700 pages of the Patient Affordable Care Act, whatever the hell they call it. That is absurd. Furthermore, if you're a big retail employer, for the lower income people, the people who work in your stores, there's a rule that says, as part of this legislation, that 90% of all of your premium has to go on to pay for claims. So there won't be profiteering at the lower level. I just get the concept. The problem with it is in America, we're big on innovation and making things better. If I figure out a way to take care of your health care for 20% less, there's no incentive in the world for me to do it because I got to pass it all on. So why would you have the entrepreneurial ingenuity to make things better? Because there's no incentive to do so. And then these bill, like all these other regulations, has nothing but pandering to special interests. So one prominent special interest is the AARP. And they put a rule in here that says that for John and I, whose health care costs a lot more than Taylor's. I just had knee replacement surgery that cost like 80 grand. Taylor's not gonna spend 80,000 over 5 years. Yet the rule says that my premium can be no more than 3 times Taylor's premium. You know what that means? Taylor, and like many of the younger people in this room, are going to be paying twice what you ought to be paying for health insurance, thanks to this legislation and pandering to the AARP. And this is the kind of stuff that we just can't have. It's hard enough starting a business without these obstacles. Another great example, and I'll shut up, is it has to do with risk. Granted, a bunch of investment banks in New York and London screwed up our financial markets by making crazy mortgage bets. Why in the world should the legislation, which was intended to regulate these people, affect companies ranging from Lululemon to PetSmart, who don't create a lot of systemic risk to our system? Yet in every one of these companies now, the board of directors has to spend probably 3 or 4 hours going over all the risk factors for the enterprise and for the system as a whole. Now, I tell you what, when you're focused on risk factors, are you creating jobs? No. There's no legislation that says you ought to be looking at opportunities, because opportunities create jobs. No, we want to regulate risk. Same thing for executive compensation. I'm chairman of 3 public comp committees. We got to put a long report together how our employment practices and compensation schemes don't create company or systemic risk. Believe me, selling pet food, we're not creating systemic risk. Yet we spend hours and hours talking about this instead of talking about how to grow jobs and grow the American economy. It's crazy.
And I put your chart up.
And there's a chart that speaks to what I was talking about.
And you say economically significant, those are ones that cost over $100
Million.
These are
Look
not,
at that skyrocket.
These are not little bitty things. These are big ones.
This is not progress.
I hate telling anecdotes, but I think this is important.
Your pool story is great.
I
gotta
gotta tell this story, okay? Because this is the stuff that's the difference between inside the Beltway policy stuff and out in the real world, okay? We've always accommodated, and according to the ADA, in all of our hotels, we have to have so many compliant rooms, and that means a compliancy in terms of the bathrooms, a compliancy in terms of access to tubs, different things with regard to life safety aspects within the room. And one of the things they've always said is that you need to have accessibility to your pools. And so our hotels have always had portable pool lifts for anybody that is disabled that wants to be lifted into the pool. I did a survey recently and asked, I think we have 11 hotels that have pools and spas. I said, have we ever had anybody use one? Okay. Nobody in my entire company in the hotel side can ever remember anybody ever asking to use it. Just recently, the Department of Justice announced that despite this, and I've asked other people that, in other companies, they just announced that you have to permanently install a electrically operated, self-operated, permanent pool lift in each, quote, body of water. For my company, that'll cost somewhere around $200,000 to $250,000.
For something nobody will ever use.
If somebody could tell me this is greatly going to accelerate disabled people's uses of your water sources and enjoyment of the pool, I'd say, okay, you've done that study, you've done some demonstration projects, you've shown the public that when those things are available, disabled people have more rights, that's fine. But they haven't. They just come out and say no. Now, the other thing is my understanding, I'm told, and I could be wrong, is that you're supposed to have this in by March 15th. Well, they don't have enough electronic, none of our pools are attended, and so I can't wait to go out and see 3 12-year-old boys trying to figure out how to move this thing up and down with each other and play pirate with it, okay, as we walk in. But this is the kind of example I could give you, and you could go on, and people go, really? Is that real? You know, is it discrimination against disabled people if their vanity is 1 inch shorter in the hotel room than in non-disabled rooms? I don't think so. That's one of the new cognitive dissonance out of control, okay? This is the kind of nonsense that we're dealing with, and it diverts, as you said, time away from focusing on what you need to do positive.
Well, let's go. We've got some more poll results, which I'm sure you all have a copy of. But let's go on and have a conversation about some of these issues. One thing that we've talked about this morning, and the three of us have talked about a lot, along with, actually this was Brad Anderson's point, who is another one of our members who's former CEO of Best Buy, is these regulatory issues are affecting big businesses and small businesses. But the big businesses have an advantage, because you've got teams of lawyers and policy analysts to help you figure it out. But for the small businesses, they don't have that, and it affects them differently. And we see from various studies, like the one the Small Business Administration put out a couple years ago, that showed that regulations, because of this, affect, on a per employee basis, small businesses by about 36% more, about $10,000 per employee if you divide it out across the whole economy, rather than about $7,000 for a large business. So what advantage does this give to small businesses, and how does that affect the overall economic landscape? Go ahead.
I'm talking about the banking industry perspective. BB&T is a large business now, the 10th largest financial institution in the U.S., but when I started, it was a really small bank. And I can think personally, in a smaller institution, you just have less people to go to. So the regulatory burden tends to fall on the leaders of the business more than on other people in the organization, and they just simply don't have the time and energy to be creative when that's happening. Today in the banking business, and you can study the statistics, community banks are under serious financial duress in general. They're producing very low returns, and when I talk to community bankers, the regulatory issue is the one they raise over and over again. And this tightening of the regulatory pressure, since they're basically small business lenders, has really hurt that industry. And what's going to happen, and this is, if you're a large bank, so maybe that's nice for your institution, but it's bad for the economy, we're going to consolidate the banking industry down to a relatively small number of big players.
How many employees does BB&T have?
30,000.
The average community bank has 37.
So, I mean, it's a radical.
37 people, and little banks give little loans to little businesses that grow.
And what bothers me, on a more philosophical perspective, I'm sure at some intentional level that's not the regulatory goal, but at a number level I think it is a regulatory goal. Because if you're a centralized bureaucrat in Washington, D.C., you'd rather have a handful of institutions you can control than a lot of diverse institutions.
And speaking of that control, well, the people in Washington here talk about, we got to make credit available to small business. Right. It's really essential. We got to get the credit flowing. Get interest rates down to 1% or 0. We're going to get the credit flowing. Well, I work with these small businesses in our portfolio. They cannot, by and large, get credit. And when they do, it's not from a bank. It's from some quasi synthetic bank, not from an asset-based lender or something, not from a bank. And when you talk to the banks, who in some cases didn't just refused loans, but actually pulled loans from some of our companies. And you go, why? This company's got great assets. It looks like it's about to turn cash flow profitable. What's the issue? And he says, I want to do it. But when the bank regulators come down here, they're going to classify it in such a way, it puts us capital demands on us to cover this loan. We can't afford to lend you anymore. We know it's the right thing. We know it's good. We know we're not going to get stiff, but we can't do that anymore. Well, I reflect back to when I started Staples. I was losing money hand over fist, but we had a pretty good idea. I went to a small bank in Boston and said, guys, I would like to have a loan. I said, well, have you got income? Well, no. You got any assets? I said, well, yeah, I do. I've got like $12 million worth of rubber bands, paper clips, copy paper and stuff. And if this loan goes bad for any reason, you're going to have office supplies for the next couple of years at prices you never could have bought them for. And the banker said, that sounds like a reasonable deal, and give us a loan. Today, they'd laugh us out of the bank.
They'd laugh you out of the bank.
That's a big difference.
You're on the board of one of the biggest lenders in the South. You probably have some perspective on this.
Well, and I look at what's happening in our own business, and I talk to our own credit people, and they will say that we have tightened our standards more than the last 40 years, which I've been around since 1970, because of regulatory pressure. And it's very much micromanagement. What the regulators are doing is forcing you, they don't literally say you can't make a loan, but then they force you to classify it as a high risk loan, which requires you to have more capital so you can't make money in it. And so what that's doing is making it very difficult to do.
All the public interest, of course.
Always for the public. By the way, there's one great myth. It's the belief that bureaucrats act in the public interest. And this has been proven, by the way, if anybody studies economics. It's called public choice theory. bureaucrats always act in the bureaucrats' interest. Surprise, surprise, right?
So if no loan gets written off, you're a success.
So if you're working for a government regulatory agency, the only way you get in trouble is your bank gets in trouble, right? So why not be more conservative? There's no penalty to you, no risk to you from being more conservative. So and I've dealt with regulators thousands of times over a long period of time. Sometimes their regulatory interest and the public good happen to align. But if they don't,
Pure coincidence.
if they don't, they always act with what's good for the regulator. That's just, and that's incentives, and it's proven in economics.
Well, I know that Pepperdine University did a study of bankers in this country about 6 months ago, and it echoes exactly what you just said. 71% of the bankers said that they didn't do a loan to a small business because they feared the regulators, the OCC, coming in Monday morning or whatever the Monday morning's coming in and classifying that loan. Now, you have to have some faith in small business. When they first loaned me money, it wasn't because I had a lot of assets or cash. They believed in me. And today you can't do a I believe in you loan anymore, right?
Right.
Okay, I can't, I know that you're going to work like 18 hours a day and I know you're going to pay me back type of loan. And so 71% said, no, we've turned down a loan we wanted to do. Now, I would suggest that 29% of them either aren't trying to make loans at all or they're lying, okay? Because I think pretty much virtually all of them are.
I want to talk about something else. I'd call it, you can argue it's the unintended consequences, or you can argue that people just are more worried about politics and justice. One of the most pervasive, destructive bills passed, of course, is the Dodd-Frank bill, which theoretically was supposed to eliminate too big to fail. There's no evidence it's eliminated too big to fail. In fact, the rating agencies say that the big banks have better ratings because of Dodd-Frank because they've been identified as too big to fail, right? I mean, that's what systematic risk is. But here's what's interesting about it. Embedded in Dodd-Frank is something called the Durbin Amendment. And the Durbin Amendment prevents banks from charging a market price for debit card fees. Well, that's a big deal. The banking industry, and I see a lot of young people in here, in the last 20 years has moved largely to free checking. We used to charge people to have a checking account. That kept a lot of people out of the banking business. As we got rid of checks and moved to debit cards, we figured out how to bring low-income consumers into the banking business by charging the merchants for the debit cards, because a debit card is a huge benefit to a merchant. People are going to buy stuff from him. He doesn't have to clear checks. It's a wonderful benefit. The banking industry invested billions and billions of dollars in technology to develop debit cards. They don't happen magically. It's very similar to developing a drug. It's a long lead time. You can't even get patents on it. So you have this massive investment that we made over 20 years. So we have the debit card technology everybody takes for granted. It seems like, that just happened. It didn't happen. I saw it in my career. We put billions of dollars in it over a long period of time. And suddenly, over politics, in order to get the votes to pass Durbin, the merchants, Walmart, really large, huge companies, put in a price control on debit card fees. So banks cannot now recover their costs. Every time a consumer uses a debit card, we lose money. So you hear the big banks are saying, well, we can't keep doing that. It's costing the industry billions of dollars. We can't make a satisfactory return and stay in business when we lose on low-income customers. So what we're doing is ratcheting up other fees for low-income customers, which is going to drive them out of the banking business. And the only beneficiary is large merchants. It's not, and there's no evidence that Walmart cut their prices or Walgreens cut their prices because of debit card fees. There's not a shred of evidence. So the government interfered and redistributed wealth to large merchants at the expense of low-income consumers and banks. But most of the fact, in the end, banks have very low returns right now. They don't have satisfactory returns, so almost all the costs eventually will be passed into low-income consumers.
Yeah, I didn't think I'd hate anything more than Dodd-Frank, given all the risk stuff we talked about, which is part of Dodd-Frank. But Sarbanes actually gives us a race for the money. And if you think about, we invest in small emerging companies. When I was familiar with the venture capital business back when I started Staples, the preferred exit strategy was almost always an IPO. Because you could go public, you create great wealth, in many cases create a really big company and have a really big score. Today, as I look at my colleagues on the technology side, in the vast majority of cases, the exit's a sale to a big company. Well, what does that mean for our economy? The fact of the matter is, if you've got this nifty new way of manipulating databases that just to pick a name, an Oracle or somebody finds threatening, that it might be big, they'll go buy it for $50 or $100 million before it gets to be a threat. And they'll subsume it in their company. In some cases, they'll promulgate the platform. In some cases, they won't. But the fact of the matter is, the relative job creation associated with that particular enterprise is not going to be all that dramatic over time. They'll leverage the other sales force and so forth. If that company were to go public, it'd probably create hundreds, in some cases thousands of jobs. So that transformation, if you will, has definitely impacted job creation. And the reason the venture capitalists and the entrepreneurs now go for the so-called trade sale is the complexity of going public today under Sarbanes-Oxley, unless they change it. You've got to go through a massive review that, according to NASDAQ, costs you close to $2 million the year before you go public or the year after.
Before you go public.
Well, you could do it, you have a year to comply, so you can do it a year after. And then two, the ongoing cost, incremental cost, is close to $1 million. So you're a small company, let's say you're making $3 or $4 million, that's a third of your profits. That makes it a lot less attractive. Forget about the hassle factor that goes with that. Hey, you're better off selling it, and that's what happens, and it's not good.
So what you have to kind of sum that up, I think it's an axiom of American politics, is that small business creates 3/4 of the jobs, right? You all know that mantra, right? Is there anybody that hasn't heard it repeatedly? But interesting enough, if you look beyond that, and I wrote a thing called Killing the Gazelles, it's been printed in a number of places, is that a very small percent of the new small businesses create all those jobs. They're called the gazelles. They're the ones that explode. They're the ones in the garage. They're the Googles in the garage. Steve Jobs one time said, I don't fear the big guys, I fear the guys in the garage. I mean, you look at some of the companies that have created the jobs in this country. Google, a couple kids coming up with an idea for a search engine, and now these guys are doing everything with phones? Okay, so if you kill the gazelles, here's how you kill them. You stop IPOs through Sarbanes-Oxley. IPOs are down by 3/4. Okay, so you make it so that they're going to get gobbled up by the big boys. Then what's the other way that the gazelles can sprint out and create the jobs? They can go and find bankers that believe in them. Oh, now you got Dodd-Frank. You're going to cut that leg off. So what we're doing right now is we're killing the gazelles. And if any group of people, and I see them like, you know, I'm starting to more and more go into groups where I'm at the high end of the age demographic, okay, and I'm looking around here, the under 35 generation gets this concept of explosive gazelles. And if we keep killing the gazelles by cutting out IPOs, by cutting out conventional bank financing, and make it harder for private venture capital, where do they go? The gazelles die in the garage.
Mike, you made an interesting point that the under 35 gets this. I think one of the things that our poll showed is that the American people are increasingly getting this. We've been doing polling on this for over a year now, and the trend continues to favor this argument that we're making this morning. I thought one of the things that we did in this poll is we came up with a list of things that business leaders complain about. And then we asked the public, how much sympathy do you have for this? I thought that'd be worth talking about because the results were kind of surprising. Even the ones that we, like family leave rules, which we intended to sort of be something that people would have sympathy with, that they would like, and they wouldn't have a lot of sympathy with the business complaining about, we actually ended up having a total of 71% having at least some sympathy with that argument. Mike, why don't you take us through that?
Well, I'm looking at which one where you said the high taxes, certainly. You look at it, it's almost 77% or more than 3/4 say they understand it, they get that.
By the way, taxes are going higher now because you're going to get, you know, people don't necessarily understand the tax code and what the latest proposals mean. The latest proposal mean for a company like Mike's today, he pays taxes one time because he's a sub-S corporation. He pays as if he were an individual, and he pays his taxes. The new proposed regulations would mean that a corporation would pay a tax, and any money Mike got out, either as a dividend or salary, he'd pay tax again, which is a double tax. So that's not going to help create jobs. That's going to stifle job creation by the sub-S corporations, which are a big part of small business in America. Fair?
Big part. Yeah, I wish my personal income was my business income. My wife wishes that it was. Okay? And my kids would be delighted. As far as rising healthcare costs, I mean, it's no surprise, 84% of the American public say that they know that they have sympathy with business. And you know, why business really is assigned this role of getting health care is an anomaly after the World War II price, wage freezes and everything else. We don't buy auto insurance. We don't buy homeowners insurance. We don't buy anything else. But then we have what I call the annual ritual of agony, okay, when your healthcare providers come in and they go over what the increases are next year. And it's an agonizing meeting. It's something that, is somebody in the banking business or somebody in the, trying to sell yoga clothes at Lululemon. You're not really designed to try to select health insurance, but it is. It's a tremendous burden, and anybody that doesn't think that business people feel that personally has never been in the annual meeting of agony. And confusing tax rules on small business, again, a similarly high 87%. And I don't think this is because they're reading books or policy books. I think it's because they're living it out in the real world. Most people do work for some kind of small business, and they see it. They see their boss trying to figure out what to do. They see, or if they're the boss, or they see coworkers struggling to meet with these new regulations and these new challenges. And finally, it's kind of an axiomatic set. Three-quarters of the people are tired of the gridlock. I think you hear that over and over again. I guess I'm somebody that isn't expecting that gridlock goes away, certainly before next year.
One more point. Let's get to the pie chart there, Mike. And then I'd like to take some questions from you guys, but there's one more point that we might want to make here.
You talking about right balance, wrong balance?
Yeah, we asked this question again.
Yeah, I think right now this is probably reflective of where the American public's really. They realize, again, people that consider themselves progressives, I'd probably call them something different, think that here's the thing. They go, businesses always complain that every regulation is going to hurt them. And then they complain and they whine, but they absorb it, they move on, we grow in this country. And this is just another example of whining business people, and they'll get over it, okay? I think what you've seen the last few years is that they're going, wait a minute, basta, enough. We can't deal with it. We don't know where we're going. The point is that there are tipping points, and we are at that tipping point in the last few years.
And the last graph there, does this actually make a difference? Would it make a difference in hiring? It's the last thing we ask people.
I think that if you don't have to have a PhD from the School of Economics at Duh University. Do you know Duh University? Okay. The answer to that question, Taylor, is pretty simple. Duh. Okay. If you don't know where things are going in terms of taxes, regulatory environment, health care, what do? You hunker down. You build cash up. And as quote the other famous professor of economics at Duh University, Gomer Pyle, surprise, 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 we don't get jobs.
All right, we'd love to take your questions. Anybody?
I'm Mike Elms from Politico. Question about what you're seeing out in the real world. I guess only in Washington could Boston qualify as the real world. But putting aside government regulation, if you look at economic conditions, what is the biggest thing you see from your customers, your colleagues, that we don't see in the Washington bubble?
I have the opportunity to visit with lots of small, mid-sized business because it's the nature of what my company did and does. And what I see is a very interesting thing. Many of the businesses are doing fine themselves. They're saying, I'm doing fine, I'm not doing great, but I'm doing fine, but I'm not really ready to invest for the future. I'm not ready to invest for the future because of the ambiguity, but it's deeper than the ambiguity. What they're Their real fear is that the current administration's policies will actually be implemented. It's not that they're uncertain about them. If they knew they were going to happen, they'd be even more distressed. So they see that this regulatory onslaught is getting worse instead of better. I don't care what the noise is in D.C., and they're really concerned about the tax implications. They really don't get what healthcare is a huge, and it's a real negative issue because you're making judgments about healthcare for your employees. I mean, it's a personal issue. It's not just money. And you care about it. It's wrong to believe that business people don't care about their employees. They do. They're human beings. They live with them every day. So they're stuck with this both ambiguity, but way beyond ambiguity, fear that what's been proposed will actually be implemented, and it'll make them very difficult to invest for the future.
I'll just give you one example of what John's talking about. For virtually every business we work with, and there's a lot of them, public and small companies, they'd be better off paying the fine not to have Obamacare than to pay the costs that Obamacare is likely to entail. So you want to do the right thing by your associates and give them the proper health care. You're worried that the way this thing is spiraling out of control, you won't be able to afford that, and there's a lot of temptation to buy your way out of it. That's a horrible dilemma to put our business leaders into, to doing what's right for their economic status or right for their associates, more so than any time I've ever experienced in my 40-odd years in business.
Next question.
Hi, I'm Jenny Kimberly of Phasma Communications. Given the political gridlock in Washington, what are we going to do to fix all this? What's the solution? You all bring up very valid concerns.
I think what we're attempting to do by beginning to share with the American public what's going on, and now today we're beginning to meet with legislators to talk to them about what's going on, is to try to convince them to begin to roll back this tidal wave of regulation to make it easier for business. Now, and it's not just the rhetoric we hear coming out here, oh no, we got regulations are down. We know the reality is they're not down. It's to begin to really understand the implications of what they're doing and hopefully stem the tide. Am I an optimist? No. I'm a realist, but I think we'd all be remiss if we didn't try.
You know, I read the blogs every once in a while for amusement, and we're derided, the Job Creators Alliance, typically as a bunch of older white guys out here stumping the political grounds for the rich. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I have not had any rich person call me up and ask me for help, okay? They're not crying for help, okay? Second, I know these two gentlemen have been very successful, and they're not worried about their future success in the next 5 years. That's not why they're here. It is about trying to create the same opportunities that we've experienced in the last 30 or 35 years. We're not in that. And I guess I look at it and sit there and this, and ask a question, is there anybody that thinks killing the gazelles through over-regulating the chance to take a company public, is that what caused Enron? WorldCom? Some $100 million company going public? No. Was there rampant fraud there? No. Did they dump these burdens on the gazelles? Yes. Same thing with Dodd-Frank. Who in this country, on either side of the aisle, unless you just reflexively hate business, thinks that killing the gazelles makes good sense? So I guess I am somewhat optimistic. They got some thing where they agreed with, and including the President's Job Council, about ramping up, for example, Sarbanes-Oxley. Ramp it up. Just make the cutoff at like $1 billion. And let people know that if you're investing in a company like that, you better rely on audited, standard audited things rather than super audited things. There's simple things we can agree on. Is there a slight amount of risk? Perhaps. So I'm guessing there is some basis on which to agree.
And by the way,
Go ahead.
all these bills have a few good things in them. So Sarbanes-Oxley has one good thing in it, which is that you as the CEO have to attest under penalty of perjury that your numbers are good numbers. Because the reality of what that means in a business, having been a CEO of a public company, I made sure that my CFO signed too, and each division head signed too. Because if they signed, then I knew they were providing me good numbers and everybody else. So that's a pretty good thing. they'd stopped the bill there, they'd have been fine. That would have been a one-page bill, it would have been great.
One page.
Instead, we've got all this other nonsense about 404 controls and do two different people at different addresses have your passcode for your 3-person office in Paris. That's the kind of stuff that's in Sarbanes-Oxley, and it's nuts, burdensome. And I think back at Staples, we went public, we had $119 million in revenues, and like little under $1 million in our first quarter of profitability. We could never go public today. And because the Sarbanes-Oxley would have taken that profit into a loss, the amount of time we would have spent doing that, and frankly, no investment bank of any consequence, Goldman Sachs back then took us public. They wouldn't take this public today because they don't have enough fees to deal with the potential strike suit lawyers on the other side. Without that sufficient fee base of a much bigger IPO than we could have sustained, they wouldn't do it anymore. It's a very different world.
Yeah, and I think our goal, I'll speak for myself, my goal is to change people's ideas, because in the end, people act consistent with their ideas. And what we've got to convince leadership is that what may be politically expedient and sound good as communicated through the press is often economically destructive. And try to get some people that really care about the long-term good of the United States instead of getting reelected. Now, can we make that difference between now and the fall? I don't know. But if we keep that message out there, I think over time the American public will hold people more responsible. Because the kind of if you look at, for example, government deficits, what's happening with Medicare, Social Security, $1 trillion plus operating deficits up below optimal growth rate. In 20, 25 years, the United States goes broke. That's not politics, it's not Democrat, Republican, it's mathematics. It's just a fact. And we can change direction and we can fix it, but we have to change direction. We have to spend a lot less money and we've got to drive a faster growth rate. And if we don't, we will get in serious trouble. I mean, it's not really a debate, it's a fact.
And you
So,
talk about
so can we convince people to think longer term? And to me, that if you look at successful societies, they have to have a certain kind of self-discipline. And that's what we've lost as a society. And what the real battle in the United States, to me, is over personal responsibility. Are people responsible for their lives, or is somebody else responsible for taking care of me? And that changes the whole game. And actually, the foundation of Western civilization and modern societies is personal responsibility. So I think we're dealing with a really deep message that transcends just, we're taking a trend that's negative and we've taken it exponential. That's what we're describing here. We got to go attack the root of the trend. And so we're really battling about personal responsibility and thinking in the long term. Can we win that fight? I don't know, but we have to fight it because the consequences are really disastrous. And if you look at societies, and when I say countries don't go broke by filing bankruptcy, they print a bunch of money and pay off their debts with fake money. And then they always become statists. They become the next Argentina. And it happens over and over. This is not new. It's happened over and over again. Democracies are particularly prone to do this. Happened with the Greeks. It's a history of democracy. People want a free lunch, and then the society fails. And what we've got to convince people, and particularly young people, I like to talk to young audiences, that wow, even though there's going to be some pain because we've already done a bunch of stupid stuff, and people my age have been stealing from their children. They may not have meant to. They've been stealing from their own children. And we got to convince the younger people that this trend cannot continue. It'll take us years. We won't I don't know if we'll affect this election at all, but it's a long-term battle.
Yes. Hi, Chris Rugaber at AP. Sorry if I missed it earlier, but just we're all sort of trying to figure out, I want to build a little bit, I guess, on Mike's question in terms of where the economy is going. Are we really getting a recovery here or not? Is it sustainable? So maybe a little bit more about your own companies, and are you really, where do you stand in terms of growing, investing, and particularly hiring? Has all the regulation that you've been talking about really put a freeze on hiring in your companies, or are you not doing it as much as you might?
We invest in very fast-growing companies, so they are growing. They're not growing at the same rate they would be growing were there to be less regulation, were there to be greater certainty about where our healthcare environment is going to be like, were there to be greater certainty of what taxes are going to be like. I mean, if you're an entrepreneur and you own stock in your company, what the capital gains tax rate is going to be makes a material difference to you. I've seen countless companies who sold their business prematurely probably because the proprietors figured out today I can lock in my gain at a 15% tax rate. If that goes to 25, 30, or 40, I'm going to make a lot less money. So therefore, I'll just sell today. That's created some opportunities for guys like me to buy stuff at more attractive prices than in the future. But that's out there. So the answer is I think the economy is sort of taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back each month. I don't see a rapid recovery. At the same time, I think things, as John pointed out, are gradually getting somewhat better.
I would agree with that. I think the economy's getting better. It's almost inevitable because we still have a highly entrepreneurial society, and we spend a bunch of money. The real issue to me is the long term and the fact that we're sub-optimizing. This is an interesting study. People don't think about this, but we're getting a 2 to 3% growth rate. Normally, at this point in the economic cycle, we're driving way above normal growth rate.
5%.
5 or 6% because you're cutting off a bad base. So I mean, just the mathematics of that. The difference between 5% and 3% is incredibly big, compounded over 10 years. And long term, if let's say that these policies drive our growth rate to 2%, which is what the prediction, versus 3%. Now, I hate to step on towns, but we did a study of this. We operate in Charleston, West Virginia, and Charlotte, North Carolina. Now, I don't know how many of you have been to Charleston, how many of you have been to Charlotte, but Charleston's a great place to live. But in 1950, Charleston and Charlotte had the same population and the same economic well-being. Today, there's a huge difference. And the difference is only a 1% compound growth rate compounded over 20, 30 years. That's what drives that kind of difference.
John, can I give that an illustration I think that I think really hits home? We haven't had the robust job growth, and again, going back to killing the gazelles. If we could accomplish anything today, is that every time you hear Dodd-Frank and you hear Sarbanes-Oxley, I want you to think of Bonnie and Clyde, okay? Because Bonnie and Clyde did not hit big banks on Wall Street. They hit little banks on Main Street, okay? So if those two things hit the little guy on Main Street and kill the gazelles, we will never have the type of job growth that we really need in this country. Now, I just want to leave you with one factoid. If for the next 36 years we had a 4% compounded growth rate, we would have a median household income in the United States of America of $200,000. Now, I can look around and see that some of you will be my age or close to my age if we could do that. And that's the kind of country I would like to have, which is the equality of affluence and not the equality of stagnation.
And I think, one measurement of every economy and how well it's doing is what its currency is like. It's kind of like your country's stock price, right? Well, our stock price has not done real well. I remember back a few years ago when there were 130 euros to the dollar. Today it's the other way around, and Europe ain't doing so great as a baseline. So, should we be happy with our progress? I think the answer is no.
We've got time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. Anybody?
Hi, Chad Sinclair, CBS News. Question for Mr. Whalen to kind of go along with the gazelles and working in the garage. What type of evidence have you seen of maybe a decline of those people in the garage? Is there a decline of innovation with increases in regulation? And also, what would you say to those people who are trying to be those next generations of entrepreneurs?
Oh, I don't think there's. I think that the people coming out of college. My son just graduated last year. I think the idea, when I graduated from college, 35 years ago, people thought about going and working for a Fortune 500 company. Today, you go to the people that are in business or even engineering, they want to start up their own company. No, the lack of entrepreneurial spirit is stronger than ever. What is scary is that Ferraris need gas. I always said a Ferrari without gas is nothing but a really beautiful coffee table, okay? It just sits there and does nothing, all right? And so what we're talking about when we're talking about killing the gazelles is if we cut off the gas supply, which is money, IPOs, you cut off the gas supply from the banks, and you discourage private investment, it's not that the spirit's not there, they just can't get out of the garage.
I think one good measurement of that is IPO activity.
Yeah.
And IPO activity is down by 3/4. So there's a dramatic decline and the amount of companies that are surging forward. I'd say, one other thing that I think it's worth noting. Until we solve our deficits, and we're running $1 trillion per year deficits, and with the entitlement structure being what it is, it's going to get worse over time. Our capital markets reflect the uncertainty that entails. Foreigners' willingness to invest in the United States is affected by that uncertainty and negativity towards it, because there's no faith that the folks in Washington are going to solve our deficit problems. And unless they do, confidence in America, confidence in capital formation is going to be impacted.
Amen.
Go ahead, Neil.
Neil Irwin, the Washington Post. You've mentioned a couple of times the kind of uncertainty around taxes and deficits. There's the level of taxes and there's the uncertainty thing. So, January 1 of next year, we have no idea what the tax code is going to look like, which obviously makes it hard to plan. Would you, in terms of your own businesses, do you feel like you'd be better off knowing what taxes are going to be, even if it's somewhat higher and even if there's some increases? How valuable is certainty, even if that certainty is around an outcome that's not exactly what you would prefer?
Well, I guess the answer to that, it depends. I'm more than willing as an individual to go pay my fair share. And if somebody says that we're going to tax carried interest, fine, go tax carried interest at ordinary income and that kind of thing. I'm open-minded to that because this is not about me. But I do think that if you, for example, raise the capital gains rate to 40%, just to pick the ordinary income rates, do I think, even if you had certainty associated with it, would that impact the amount of entrepreneurs who are going to start their businesses? Yeah, on the margin, I think it would.
I would say if we ended up, the uncertainty is an issue, but the reason that people worry about the uncertainty is they see the bad side. So they see what they think are the worst proposals. I mean, if every proposal was good, the fact that it was uncertain wouldn't matter, right? It's that some proposals are probably good for business and some are really bad for business. So I think that the fact that the uncertainty includes a set that has a high probability of really being bad for business is what causes people to be concerned. And so it's not just, I think it's actually the potential of the negative outcome. And if we knew that negative outcome was certain, we would be worse off. I grew up, in business in the early 1970s where tax rates were actually higher. And one of the things that Reagan did, we had a stagnant, terrible economy. People forget this. In the 1970s, it was a really bad economy. We were losing on all fronts. And one thing Reagan did was cut tax rates. And the reason that mattered is twofold. In the 70s, all anybody did was figure out how to avoid taxes. They didn't care whether they created jobs, because it was when your marginal tax rate ends up very high, 60, 70%, it becomes an ethics issue because you feel like you're being robbed. And so people did lots of dumb investments to somehow avoid paying taxes. And Reagan got that. High taxes destroy the incentives. And this potential increase in the capital gains tax is a big deal. We know that high capital gains tax reduces productivity. I mean, we've tried that, and it didn't work. And I think, the smarter people and some of the people who've been around a long time say, wow, a lot of this stuff this is not new. This is old stuff, and it didn't work.
A better example, if you look at the Affordable Health Care Act and its implications, there the uncertainty is between is it bad or is it worse? I mean, there's not a lot of scenarios out there in conversation in the business community that this is going to be somehow good. So it's degree of bad is what we're talking about. And, depending how bad it turns out to be and how many things they want to go cover and how many caps they want to go eliminate, it could be horrible. So certainty would not necessarily, if it's in that range of outcomes, be a good thing. It'd be just about as bad as we are today, which is not good.
All right. Thank you so much for coming. If there's anyone who would like to talk afterwards, please feel free to stay behind.